Um, Sorry for these glitches in the system. My name is Sean Jacobs. It is now 2:02 p.m. here in New York City. I'm an associate professor of international affairs at the New School. Welcome to this event, a panel discussion on the global movement for Black Lives. Before we start, I would like to read the housekeeping statement. This event is being recorded. I want to remind attendees that microphones are already muted and your videos are off. The recording will be sent after the event. If you can please use the Q&A feature throughout the event to send questions to the speakers. These questions will be collected and be addressed to the speakers during the Q&A. The Q&A will be moderated. This event is organized by the Graduate Program in International Affairs here at the New School. For those who want to learn more about the program, we have linked to a short video in the chat. Today's event is a discussion on the politics and recent history of the global movement for Black Lives, with voices from the US, Brazil, the United Kingdom, and South Africa. The event is part of the Decolonizing International Affairs lecture series. This is the third event in the series. The previous two events were on drug politics from AIDS to COVID-19, and secondly, on the problem with economics. The videos of both events are available online, and we are providing links again in the chat. This event itself will be archived online and will be available for viewing afterwards. Students from the New School course, Theories, Histories, and Practices of Development, Decolonizing International Affairs, are joining this series. This is part of their class, and I want to welcome students from that course to the event. That class surveys the field of international affairs in response to new global realities and pressures and struggles, from Black Lives Matter and democratic socialism to ascendant right-wing movements and conflicts stemming from the acute ecological and health crisis that confronts us now. For today's discussion on Black Lives Matter, we have four panelists: Olufemi Taiwo, Marilene Felinto, Elliot Cooper, and William Shoki, or Will Shoki. Each of these panelists will make remarks of about 7 to 10 minutes. I will then ask them 2 rounds of questions, and we will then open for questions from the audience. I will introduce each panelist before they speak. So I'm not going to introduce everyone all at once. I'm going to introduce them before they speak. So they'll speak in this order. We'll have Olufemi will speak first, Marilene, Adam, and then William. So let me introduce Olufemi, who's going to be our first speaker. Olufemi Taiwo is an assistant professor of philosophy at Georgetown University. He completed his PhD at the University of California, Los Angeles. Before that, he completed BAs in philosophy and political science at Indiana University. Olufemi is currently writing a book entitled Reconsidering Reparations that considers a constructive philosophical argument for reparations and explores links with environmental justice. He also writes public philosophy, including articles exploring intersections of climate justice and colonialism. Olufemi, you have the floor.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks to everybody for being here and for the help putting the panel together. I'm not going to talk for too long because I'm just interested in hearing what everyone else has to say. But obviously, the global movement for Black Lives is something that takes on a lot of issues. The kind of family of issues that I've been thinking about and doing some work around recently has been climate justice. And I'm worried about this for a variety of reasons, one of which is I'm not, I can't tell whether we understand how dire the situation is for Black peoples, for people of African descent across the world. So I'm just gonna say a few basic facts that are central to my understanding of what the stakes are. So in 2009, a little bit over a decade ago, there were bitter negotiations over what the global temperature target should be. And Diaping, who was chair of the African negotiators, was incensed at the idea that 2 degrees was a sensible temperature target for the world, especially given the low amounts of funding provided for Africa and the global South in making and executing climate policy under the plan that was being proposed at that meeting. And the way he put it was striking. He said that the amount of money they were offering wouldn't be enough to buy us the coffins, because the 2-degree target, as he understood it, was apocalyptic. More than a decade later, we're now on course for something in excess of 3 degrees. And that is a global average. Global temperature increase isn't evenly distributed across the world. Regions of Africa could expect as much as 1.5 times the global average. So we could see warming closer to 4.5 degrees. That's just to talk about the ecological crisis, because as much as governments in the global north pretend to be denialists when they're talking about climate crisis, at the level of institutional preparedness, they are not denialists at all. There are a host of technological companies that are creating the newest 21st century post-technological revolution forms of border surveillance. There are growing far-right policies and growing far-right parties in many global north countries, but not exclusively global north countries. And the combination of the racism we already understand with these temperature targets, with the rates of displacement of peoples that would be caused by these ecological targets, would be a clearly genocidal scenario. The one other thing I'm going to add is that, as we know, these things aren't just ecological that we're talking about. All this is political backwards and forwards. And one of the aspects of politics that we should be talking about is that even if we supposedly get things right from a global perspective, we start investing more in renewable energy, so on and so forth, it matters how and it matters where. Something like a quarter of the arable land on the African continent has been bought up in large-scale land acquisitions in a process that accelerated after the global financial crisis of 2008. So the available land for agriculture much of it will be run exclusively for profit rather than for the food and energy security of African people. That doesn't yet take into account even more land grabs, which are underway on the African continent and Brazil. And all of that is occurring against the backdrop of the fact that until very recently, it was considered global politics was oriented in a way that encouraged countries to rely on their resource allotments. So places like Nigeria, Angola, Equatorial Guinea, South Sudan are very dependent in terms of government revenue on the extraction of fossil fuels rather than lower carbon forms of fuel. So if the world goes towards renewable energy, there are some questions to answer about what a better way of funding government looks like in those places and how we're going to get there from here. So all of that is very, none of that sounds nice, and it shouldn't, because we have our work cut out for us here. But I think the other flip side of this very bad news is the whole world has to change. The way that we have been doing energy production, the way that we've been doing politics is completely incompatible with continued human life on this planet. And, that isn't just dire, that is also an opportunity. If we can, this is the time to push for better ways of living, better ways of relating to the planet, better ways of relating across borders or in the absence of borders. And so I think now is the time to push for things like public power, community control over energy, community control over food systems, and taking the decision-making out of the hands of the corporations and multinational institutions that have gotten us into this mess, and to put it back into the hands of the people that have to live with the consequences of the decisions that they make. And so that's something that I hope we can take up as a movement. I'll stop there.
That's an excellent start. Thank you, Olufemi. I'm definitely going to ask you to say a little bit more later on about your suggestion that the way we do politics has to change. So maybe you could, but when we get to question time. So our next speaker is Marilene Felinto, who is a Brazilian writer and newspaper columnist. She's from Recife in the northeast of Brazil, but grew up in São Paulo, where she also went to college. Her novel, The Woman of Tijo Copapo, I'm probably butchering that now, has been translated from the original Portuguese into English, French, Dutch, and Catalan, and has won a number of prizes. She has written a number of other books also. She's a columnist with probably the most important newspaper in Brazil, Folha de São Paulo. Marilene, you have the floor.
Well, hello, everybody. I'm glad to be here, Sean, and panelists and students, attendees. First of all, I have to say that Brazil faces one of the most tragic moments in its history as the result of a pandemic, which is criminally ignored or denied by the federal government of President Jair Bolsonaro, who belongs to a political group of far right wing and of a fascist profile. More than 3,000 people a day are dying in the country, victims of the COVID, in a country that paradoxically has one of the best and most egalitarian public health systems in the world. The lack of central government coordination of the pandemic, coupled with an irresponsible and discriminatory foreign policy directed to countries with which Brazil has had very fraternal ties in the recent past, such as India and China, led to a dramatic lack of vaccines and medicines to fight the pandemic. So the atmosphere around here is of indignation, helplessness, and depression. While the pandemic itself has prevented people from taking to the streets to protest and demand change. Not to mention that Brazil is in the global south. Multinational pharmaceutical companies have been delivering vaccines first to those countries which have the most of money, as you know. Of the total vaccines distributed, 75% were left with the 30 richest countries, while the population of the 134 countries in the global south has not yet had access to them. It is important to point out that in Brazil, from an ethnic and gender point of view, the pandemic is particularly lethal for poor, Black, and indigenous peoples. Now, what about the global movement for Black lives as concerned to Brazil? For more than 1 century, since the end of slavery here in the year 1818, the fallacious discourse that Brazil is a racial democracy based on the fact that we are the most miscegenated country in the world has covered up the real situation of racism here. Actually, nowadays, because the Bolsonaro government is an openly racist government, Black Brazilians are even losing some of the few achievements obtained during the 12 years of the leftist and socially oriented governments of Lula da Silva and Dilma Rousseff. The government of Dilma Rousseff was ousted in 2016 by a political, judicial and media coup plot. But the fight against racism in Brazil dates from long ago and has mobilized dozens of organizations that have struggled for a long time. There are several chains of thought and action, diversified agendas and forms of struggle aiming the same objective of getting social justice for Black people in the country. There has been some progress, especially concerning some affirmation of Black identity and concerning the fight for more representativeness in the media, in politics, in enterprises, etc., mainly among Black young people whose self-consciousness is much more acute on the issues involving race. I think the global movement for Black lives has an influence among these youngsters, especially after the murder of George Floyd. Though it must be stressed that police brutality against Blacks is not at all something unusual here. Black children, adolescents, and mainly Black young men are killed every day by the police in the slums, the favelas of Rio de Janeiro, and in the poor neighborhoods in the surroundings of big cities like São Paulo. According to official reports, in the past 5 years, between 2015 and 2020, 581 young people up to 19 years old have been murdered by the police forces in the city of São Paulo. This is more than the other 504 who died of several other violent causes in the same city in the same period of time. The report also points out that from the age of 15 years old, Blacks are 62% of the dead, although they are 42% of the population of this age group. Data published in 2017 show that of every 100 people killed in Brazil, 71 are Black. But I would say that there is some hope in the near future. Right after the murder of George Floyd, and I just would like to indicate that this is where the people should show the pictures on the screen now, okay? So right after the murder of George Floyd and after João Alberto Silveira, a Brazilian Black man, was beaten and killed by 2 private security white guards of a supermarket in the city of Porto Alegre in November 2020, some protests could be seen bringing up more visibility to Black cause here. Following similar actions in the US, Black artists occupied the main avenues of São Paulo, stopped the traffic, and painted on the asphalt. So if you want to show, yeah, in big white capital letters, Vidas Pretas Importam, which means Black Lives Matter. Besides that, very important initiatives, like the one called the Black Coalition for Rights, Coalizão Negra por Direitos, have been denouncing Brazil's racism abroad. So if you can stop the picture now, it's okay. Since 2019, the Black Coalition for Rights brings together 150 other groups and organizations of the Brazilian Black movement. It is very active in the fight for social justice for the 56% of the population. This is the amount of Black people here in Brazil, 56% of the 220 million Brazilians. They have denounced Brazil before the Organization of American States concerning Bolsonaro's government necropolitics on public security. The complaint was based on police violence in the states of Rio and São Paulo. Also, the Black Coalition went to the US in 2019 to denounce rights violations of the government. They participated in the Black Caucus Congress in Washington, DC, a meeting that brought together African-American congressmen, politicians, and Black leaders from across the US. The big problem in Brazil is its ruling class, one of the most perverse in the world. It is of a white elite with a colonial slavery mentality, a mix of landlords and civilian and military commanders, as says one of our best social scientists, Darcy Ribeiro, an elite used to being hostile to the mass of the people condemned to arbitrariness, ignorance, and poverty. Rather than maturing as a democratic society, the country is constantly backtracking when it comes to social justice, when it comes to human rights, when it comes to the rights of its most vulnerable citizens, when it comes to end racism once and for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marilene. That was really good. In fact, we already have 2 questions from the audience, but so if while Adam speaks, it might be useful for the other speakers to just look over there at those questions, because I'm going to ask some of them later. It's in the Q&A box. Okay. So our next speaker is Adam Elliot Cooper. He's a research associate of the Applied Sociology Research Group at the University of Greenwich in Britain. He received his PhD from the School of Geography and the Environment at the University of Oxford in 2016. He previously worked as a researcher in the Department of Philosophy at the University College London, also as a teaching fellow in the Department of Sociology at the University of Warwick, and as a research associate in the Department of Geography at King College London. He sits on the board for today's purposes. This is an important mention. I hope you'll say something about it, of the monitoring group, an anti-racist organization challenging state racism and racial violence in the UK. And he just published a book called Black Resistance to British Policing from Manchester University Press. Adam, you have the floor.
Thanks so much, Sean, for that very long introduction. I very much appreciate it. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about Britain and Black politics in Britain, which I imagine for most the US audience can sometimes leave people looking slightly perplexed. You guys have Black politics in Britain? You guys have Black people in Britain? Sometimes that's even a surprise. And I think one of the reasons that Britain has been able to portray itself as this country where it doesn't really do race. Race is a very terribly crass thing that happens in the United States and used to happen in South Africa, but everything's kind of sorted out now. But Britain doesn't do any of that kind of crass race stuff. You know, here in Britain we do class. We're a class system. We love the class system. We love it so much. We've still got a royal family. We love the class system. We're so comfortable with the class system. But I think one of the reasons that Britain has been able to portray this this kind of non-racial image to the world is because Britain has done most of its racializing historically over the past 300 or 400 years, not on the British mainland. It's done most of its racializing in its colonies, in the Caribbean, in much of the African continent, across South Asia and parts of Southeast Asia, across Australia, and of course, up until the War of Independence in the US of A as well. And so because there is this large geographical disjuncture between Britain and most of its race making, there is also been this quite convenient conceptual disjuncture that Britain has been able to propagate between itself and its histories of racism and its histories of white supremacy and racial capitalism. So in this context of empire and imperialism, we begin to instead see is that actually racism and Britishness and Britain as a nation state are fundamentally linked together. In fact, Britain, which was founded in 1707, has never existed without colonies, and therefore it's less helpful, I think, to understand it as a nation state and more useful to understand it as an imperial state. And it's in this context of imperialism that I think we can also understand Britain's Black Power movement. Because Britain's Black Power movement, which many people may not be familiar with, is also a movement which did not begin or has not solely been concentrated on the British mainland. Britain's Black Power movement and many of its or the movements which kind of came before the Black Power movement that led to the Black Power movements were situated in Britain's colonies, whether it be the Black Power, whether it be the anti-colonial movements through the workers' struggles in places like the Caribbean, where I do a fair bit of my research, but of course also in the Black movements across much of the African continent and other parts of the world as well, where people were organising to resist and challenge both British power and British racism, but of course imperialism more generally as well. And it's in this context that Black power in Britain on the British mainland emerges in the 1960s and 70s, led by people principally from the British colony and former British colony of Trinidad, where many of those people were involved in both the anti-colonial movements and the subsequent Black Power movements in that country, which sought to drive US and other multinational corporations out of Trinidad and develop a kind of a socialist states there in ways that were eventually achieved in other parts of the Caribbean, such as in Grenada and elsewhere, and before US intervention. And so what's crucial in appreciating, understanding Black power and Black politics in Britain is that it's always been international. It's been necessarily international. It's never been able to be inward looking, because the people who migrated to Britain in significant numbers after World War II were always connected to the places where they came from or where their parents came from. And they always had one foot or one ear in the Caribbean or the African continent, and were always in conversations with people who'd come from other parts of the British Empire, principally the Indian subcontinent, but also places in Southeast Asia and of course Ireland as well. And so it's this internationalism, as well as, of course, the anti-imperialism of Black politics in Britain, which I think is really fundamentally important to Britain's contribution, I guess, or Black Britain's contribution to this global movement for Black lives today. So what of Britain today? What of Britain that likes to point the finger at countries like the United States and others as the place where racism really happens and where the real racism happens? Or once America sorts itself, once we're as bad as America, then we'll start to make some changes and take these kinds of protests seriously. And I think one of the things that we begin to see emerging in Britain, particularly since the late 1980s, early 1990s, is the kinds of colonial forms of policing which had been honed in Britain's colonies. So when we think about the fact that Britain first started using baton rounds or rubber bullets in the 1980s, following Black urban rebellions in cities like Toxteth in Liverpool, or Moss Side in Manchester, or Tottenham in North London, and began to normalise the use of these kinds of weaponry through the use of these kinds of, before which were only used in colonial policing operations against Black communities during these decades. And we begin to also see the expansion of our prison system being perpetuated in this period, and particularly starting to escalate in the 1990s and early 2000s, again legitimised through colonially derived racial logics. So the idea that Britain is awash with muggers and gangsters and terrorists and illegal immigrants and all of these kind of what Paul Gilroy calls black folk devils or racialized folk devils have enabled this expansion of Britain's prison system. And so what we've seen since the early 1990s in Britain is a prison system which is a prison population which has almost doubled. Britain now incarcerates Black people at the same rates the United States incarcerates African Americans. Britain has effectively a segregated prison system where it has prisons which are specifically for so-called foreign nationals, and also it has a separate prison system which are called immigration detention centres, which you obviously have in the US as well. And we should understand what these are. These are forms of racialised segregation within Britain's prison system. And so it's in this context that the current movement for Black lives in Britain arises. In 2020, we see the largest anti-racist protests in Britain's history, in solidarity with what's taking place in the US, with a keen focus on the issues which are arising here on the British mainland. And it's through articulating both the politics of abolition for challenging the criminal justice system, which is the issue in the immediate reality of many of Black Britain's Black communities, but also drawing upon that international history of anti-imperialism and international solidarity, that I think we see the most interesting convergence of Black politics in Britain, which is facing outward and looking to the rest of the world in this global movement for Black lives. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Adam. That was great. So we have one more speaker, and I can see that the questions are lining up. People are excited to ask you guys questions. So let's go to our final speaker, who is William Shoki, who is a graduate student in philosophy at Wits University in Johannesburg, South Africa, and is a staff writer of Africa as a Country. William is also on the steering committee of the South African BDS Coalition, and he has published in Jacobin, Verso, the Mail and Guardian, among others. Will?
Thank you very much, Sean, and I'm truly honored to be present on this panel alongside everyone else. I think for my contribution today, I'm going to do my absolute best to try on and build on the reflections that everyone else has contributed prior. I'm glad for one that Adam has acknowledged the oversized role Great Britain has in the politics of its former colonial territories. He's cut out a lot of my work, so it's just blame Britain, and I suppose I can explain a lot of the dynamics of South Africa today. But to talk about the dynamics of South Africa today, I think one thing that is interesting about South Africa is that if you were to ask anyone if there is a movement for Black lives in South Africa, they'd probably tell you no, which is to say that to the extent which people are talking about abolition or defunding the police or any of that kind of rhetoric and argument being made, that's pretty much not really existence in South Africa. But I think to conclude that there is no movement for Black lives, I think would be misguided, and hopefully I can show why. One thing that I think is very interesting about South Africa is that when you look at its history of policing, it's more or less a kind of exemplification of a lot of the debates that people around the world are having now, a lot of the different directions that countries could go to now. So South Africa is a place where police reforms have been tried to a large extent. Our police service was an attempt to modify and transform. Our police service was made after the end of apartheid, given that the South African police force, as it previously was known, was, as Adam alluded to earlier, an oppressive political institution. So in 1994, at the end of apartheid, the South African Police Service came into being after the first democratic general election. And after it was established, the focus of the police service was for it to be a social institution that emphasized community policing, that was accountable, that tried to empower citizens to play an oversight role in how it functioned, but that largely failed. The South African Police Service today is one of the most violent police forces in the world. In fact, at the end of the 2019-20 financial year, it reported 424 deaths. And that means that South Africa, the police kill someone roughly every 20 hours. And compared to the United States, South African police kill roughly 2.5 more people per capita. So it's one of the most violent police forces in the world, in spite of the fact that significant efforts to try and undo the colonial legacy were made. So to ask the question of how come, despite these concerted efforts at reform and transformation, the South African police force still remains this violent, oppressive figure in society, I think it's important to sort of emphasize the way South Africa's political economy is structured and how South Africa's political economy continues to create conditions where the police are going to inevitably remain violent and oppressive. Now, to quickly go back to understand what the South African police was like before 1994, when it was established on the 1st of April in 1913, it was fundamentally called upon to aid the military to overpower opposition to the apartheid and colonial governments. The South African police force was the main apparatus of what was then a police state during apartheid. And this colonial policing system that it implemented in South Africa was originally pioneered by the Royal Irish Constabulary, which suppressed anti-colonial sentiment by Irish natives. So the police fundamentally existed to police South Africa's non-white populations in rural areas and to manage their presence in cities. The goal of policing wasn't really to serve and protect citizen populations, but was to control movement, to suppress collective action, and to ensure that no political dissent could be successful. So as South Africa entered the post-apartheid period and was searching for a new model of policing, it largely tried to be an adoption of the sort of British liberal model of policing, which emphasized decentralization and absence of militarism and arms, and trying to be broadly reflective as much as possible of the social composition of society. So there was supposed to be this fundamental change where the police were portrayed as protectors of the public and no longer to be identified with oppression. But that change actually managed to succeed for a very small window of time. Between 1995 and 2007, for example, demonstrations, strikes, and marches where the police's role fundamentally exists to manage crowds, they were able to do this collaboratively and cooperatively. There once existed a unit called the Area Crime Combating Unit of the South African Police Service, which collaborated with protesters and social movements to ensure that demonstrations which happened were largely peaceful. Of course, this wasn't always the case, but until 2007, this managed to happen with some degree of success. And then that got disbanded in 2008. And the 2008 financial crisis happened. And I think this is an important turning point, not only in terms of understanding policing in South Africa, but also understanding policing internationally. 2008 happens. In 2010, South Africa gets a police commissioner by the way of Bheki Cele, and he, I think, surprises the nation when he advocates for this policy of shoot to kill, which was effectively an encouragement for law enforcement to use maximum force in confrontational situations. And those confrontational situations increased significantly after 2008, because what happened was the post-apartheid political order, which adopted a neoliberal growth model, started to unravel. And the apartheid government, the post-apartheid government, which had previously promised South Africans to expand employment, grow wages, and lift people out of poverty, was unable to do that. And South Africans were noticing, and social unrest steadily began to increase. So from 2008, you notice these explosive periods of social uprising, and you notice tremendous use of violence by the police in response. So Andries Tatane is murdered on live South African television during a service delivery protest in 2012. The Marikana massacre happens in 2012. The Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall protests happen in 2015 and 2016. And there's just this tremendous accumulation of social unrest that happens across South African society, which calls into question the structure of political economy in South Africa. And South Africa's state apparatuses notice, they're nervous. They feel that the system is no longer in this comfortable and protected place. And so I think what we are starting to witness even more of now is a sort of return of this period of unrest. I think the COVID-19 lockdown here in South Africa certainly gave the police this period of respite where they had inflated powers to police the lockdown, and they were fundamentally disciplining and policing poor and working class populations who they were afraid would respond to the state of lockdown, given that the lockdown announced their inability and made it impossible for poor and working class communities to survive. And as the conditions of South Africans worsen as a result of the pandemic and the economic crisis that it's wrought, we're witnessing again this posture of policing becoming more and more hostile, becoming more and more antagonistic, and effectively treating populations as this force which presents a threat and danger to law and order, and who in their discontent and in their restlessness might spell an explosion of anarchy. So I'm running out of time now, but I think what I'll leave my reflection is at this. I think when we ask the question of whether or not there's a movement for Black lives in South Africa, I think in an indirect way there is, because a lot of South Africans are starting to become restless, are starting to make demands for public goods, for public transportation, for universal healthcare, for a universal basic income grant. And I think it's in that frontier in which the fight against violent policing is being waged, because what ordinary South Africans are able to do quite intuitively is to say that the conditions which contribute to the supposed need for policing in the first place, which is always thrown up as crime, is exactly what we need to combat by creating an egalitarian society where people have access to the basic requirements for their survival. And I think that ultimately the struggle against violent policing has to be a struggle for socialism. And I think that these connections are being made here and globally. And I look forward to doing the work to make sure that they're realized.
So maybe I'll ask I'll start by asking the first question, and then because I can see the questions are nice questions. So why don't I ask the first one, just to kind of ask a question which is more general and which I'm hoping you all could contribute to. So Olufemi said that the way that we do politics has to change, and I think, and so he's suggesting a kind of the connection between the crisis of the climate and kind of the racial, endemic racism. Will points to socialism more explicitly. I think Will's pointing to kind of a socialist alternative, just by way of kind of setup. Where can we go look for this politics? And I was just reminded as I was sitting here that it's interesting that we're talking about a global movement for Black lives, when in fact there are precedents for kind of globally organizing Black people, although the time was very different, the conditions were different. And I'm thinking here particularly of, there was a Pan-African Congress that met for the first time in 1900, which was organized by Du Bois and Ida Gibbs Hunt, who actually worked for the US, was a diplomat working for the US government in France. But the interesting thing about that conference is that it only got interesting about 19 years later, when I think it was the next 4 conferences were the ones that were really interesting, until 1945, when after 1945, it sort of, it declined. The thing about this was, at these conferences, the debate was really very much about European colonialism, racism, and also like the participants were quite left-wing. I mean, Du Bois himself was an avowed socialist. So I'm sort of wondering, by way of that long setup, to Olufemi's questions, that the way we do politics has to change. Where can you see the basis for something around a sort of global Black politics, if you want, or a politics against police brutality, against the devaluing of Black lives? Like, where can those connections are those connections, and where can they be made? So that's my first question from me, just to start things off. Whoever wants to go first. Femi, since you were the one who said that, maybe you can start us off.
Yeah, I don't know if I can answer your question, but I can say a little bit more about what I think, what I was getting at when I was saying we need to do politics differently. And the best example of this for me, or at least the easiest example, is the global COVID vaccine rollout, right? Where the vast majority of the available vaccines are committed to global North nations, and the rollout is much faster in these parts of the world, and even in countries that have them, there's unevenness about how they're being distributed, so on and so forth. And there's a lot to criticize about the vaccine rollout in terms of, morality and justice, but it also just sets the conditions that make the vaccine worse for everyone, that make the vaccine worse in general, that make it likeliest that there will be harmful variants. And to me, what that demonstrates is, the kind of all this stuff that seems rational and serious around framing climate justice in terms of state competition, which the US and China have, shown some willingness to do. At the end of the day, that's a deeply irrational and counterproductive way to try to solve global problems. So that's just, I guess that was kind of pitching underhand at what Will ended up, swinging for the fences on. But, like socialism or barbarism, those are the choices we have, right? And I'm not on team barbarism. I think cooperative socialist ways of organizing politics, and locally so, right? But that's kind of where it's at. So I'll start there, but I think more people will say.
Adam?
I guess just continuing on from this idea about the COVID-19 vaccine, I think it's quite an interesting one to think about. And it makes you think about two things. The first thing it makes you think about is this, and that's something else Femi mentioned, is this rise in nationalism, this rise in popular nationalism across the world, and how a kind of COVID vaccine nationalism has been a really important component of this. We've got to lock down our borders. We've got to make sure that our people have got the vaccine. Our people have to be first. We're not going to let other countries get in. Britain is, forget the global south. Britain's beefing France and Germany and the rest of the EU over these vaccines, right? But of course, this actually isn't good for your national interest, because, as Femi mentioned, right, this all is likely to lead to the development of other types of variants of the virus, and it will still end up spreading and actually have a further detrimental effect. And of course, there's comparisons here with climate breakdown, right? And the manner in which countries in the global north are trying to secure their access to depleting resources, secure their borders, because they know that climate refugees are likely to be coming to the shores of Europe and North America, to do all of these things to try to secure themselves in a way that actually is detrimental not only for themselves, but of course the rest of the planet. And the kind of glimmer of hope that I've been reading about recently is probably coming out, maybe speaks against something that Femi said, which is about, it's actually coming out of Cuba, right? Which is the fact that Cuba are developing 2 or 3 vaccines at the moment, and are promising to sell them at either free or at cost price to global South nations. And the idea that actually this is the big vote winner for the Cuban government. It's not nationalism, it's internationalism, and that's how they seek to gain their popularity and their legitimacy. And I think understanding that kind of international solidarity is as a way of gaining international legitimacy on the world stage, I think is and political legitimacy, I should say, sorry, for any kind of movement is really fundamentally important.
Marilene?
So I was listening to the guys speaking, and I was just feeling that it's as if Brazil was not a nation anymore. I don't even know what to say about that. You see, about how to change our political way of acting around here. So we are in a very specific moment, a very difficult moment with a terrible government. So there is no nationalism anymore. The attitude here is completely different concerning, for example, vaccines. The Bolsonaro government simply ignored not only the COVID itself, but the need to buy vaccines last year, and so I really don't know what to say. I really don't know how to explain how the country came to this point, after 12 years of governments which were really which really cared for the people, for the poor people, you know. So I'm sorry, I don't really have any statement to make about that right now.
About the ability to make politics differently, Will?
Yeah, I mean, I think I want to build off what everyone has said so far. I mean, when you think of the current conjuncture, for me, I think the thing that I think actually gives the biggest glimmer of hope is the climate justice politics I'm seeing starting to gain momentum around the world. And I think the reason is that as everyone is sort of at this moment where we're hopefully trying to reimagine what a world after COVID would look like, I think that in terms of the massive systems change that is going to be required to rise to the task that I think Olufemi helpfully identified for us, it's really the climate justice movement that's the only force in society at the moment that I think is presenting any kind of alternative that not only seems within the realm of possibility, but that is necessary, and that also I think will fundamentally transform society, not only at a level of policy in terms of saying these are the ways in which we can expand people's control over their lives, restore their interaction with nature, but also to make a transformation in their consciousness to say that we should be a world that isn't governed by self-interest, that isn't governed by just the interests of this or that nation and accumulating their power, but that we rewrite consciousness that it is more egalitarian. And I think that for me, that's what gives me the glimmers of hope. I mean, in some of the work that I do here, for example, even enabling people to make a very basic change in their lives can be deeply transformative if you teach someone, for example, how to grow their own garden in the backyard. And unlike sort of, environmentalist politics in like the early 2000s when it was about withdrawing from society, I think a lot of people understand this as a model for a new society and something that they want to embark on collaboratively and solidaristically and with others. And I think this is something that's fermenting like across the world. I mean, especially in the global South, especially in Africa, especially in Latin America. And it's one of those things where you have the feeling where it doesn't feel like it's burst onto the scene properly yet, but it's going to have the moments to do that. And when it does that, it's going to be explosive.
Okay, thank you very much. I have the next question, which I know Adam would be very happy to answer this first. So, of course, popular culture does kind of impact these political movements, and of course, the name Meghan Markle had to come up. And somebody just sort of asked, do you anticipate that the Meghan Markle revelation around racism in the British monarchy will instigate acknowledgement of current British racism, or will it, does these kind of things lead to anything at all? And there was another question, a separate question about the US by Yanis Chiliakis, who's sort of saying, should we care when sort of big personalities like LeBron James or Oprah or Kanye West, like, what do we do about, and I would be curious, in South Africa or in Brazil also, where you have local variants of these kind of celebrities, does it matter? Does celebrity politics matter for these kind of movements? Does it give impetus to the issues? Does it help clarify things, or is it merely a distraction? Should we care what LeBron James does or the statements that he makes, or should we be invested so much as people were in the whole Meghan Markle thing, where people are making memes or statements and declaring themselves on this issue? Let's start with you, Adam.
Yeah, obviously, Meghan Markle has married into the English aristocracy, and some people are surprised that the English aristocracy is racist. I mean, considering the fact that it's like, I mean, there are people who are so committed to the class system, they've been interbreeding for about 400 years, and a system which is obviously well built on imperialism. We shouldn't be unsurprised that they have like proto-fascistic tendencies, and so I think we could probably I think Meghan Markle, there are zero revelations that have come out of what's happened to Meghan Markle, apart from maybe that it hasn't happened sooner, or maybe the fact that it happened in the first, that she even got as far as she did in the first place. But what I think, but going to a wider question about celebrities, I mean, I think that athletes and artists and other people who have notoriety and fame can contribute to social movements, right? So historically, there are lots of athletes, like Muhammad Ali, or other people like that, have contributed to social movements in ways that I think are very productive and important. And I think we could say similar things about artists and other cultural icons who have fame and notoriety. And have contributed to important social movements. But of course, we shouldn't confuse that with valuing more what people say simply because they're famous. Of course, we have to take the substance of what they say. And so that takes us to another question as to whether the extent to which someone like LeBron James might be saying something which is in tune with a global movement for Black lives, and therefore is useful for our conversations and our struggles.
Mm-hmm. Femi? Do you care much?
No. What I will say is that I did read something. I've been trying to figure out, I've been trying to remember who it was that wrote this, but somebody wrote an article back when this happened that described the marriage of Markle and the royal family as a marriage between two houses of royal privilege, one of the Hollywood celebrity and the other of the royal family, and only one of those royal families has a future, and it's it's not the queen. And I don't know, whoever said that, hopefully someone could track down the article, but that was the best way of putting my kind of feelings about the issue. So
Will or Marilene, do you want to say anything on this question of like the role of celebrity or sports people, like today? Yeah,
I would say that here in Brazil, this is a contradictory subject. Celebrities like this football players, for example, who are Black or mixed people, like Neymar, for example, even Ronaldo, or many others, they usually do not consider themselves Black. They deny that they are Black. So this has a very bad influence in, in Chile. But this is really a situation that is very typical of the Brazilian racial thought since the beginning of the 19th century, and even the end since the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. The first intellectuals who tried to describe and define the racial composition of Brazilian people were very racist. And they wrote about that so openly, so that this led the people for decades to believe that Black people and mixed people to believe that they are inferior to white people. So this is a very present, still nowadays, with all the achievements and advances in this question of race here. We feel that people have this ideology, they believe that somehow, because they are first of all, because Black people here are the poor people, of course, and mixed people are the poor people, and so they are discriminated, very much discriminated. There's a lot of racism, but celebrities usually have this contribution to make it even worse around here. So celebrities abroad, like for example LeBron James or Lewis, the man who drives Formula One.
Lewis Hamilton.
They have a lot of influence around here in Brazil. Meghan Markle has influence here, but our Black celebrities, some of them do have, some of them are activists, anti-racism, and so on. But I would say that foreign influence is more important here than the people here in Brazil.
Well.
Nothing really to add except to say that I think, yeah, what everyone else has said is true. And I think that the increasing turn to look to celebrities for like political direction, I think just expresses how a lot of people feel kind of weak and powerless at the moment. And I think that, the challenge for progressive forces is to just rebuild collective power so that we just treat our celebrities like people who entertain us, and but that's all they are. But I think that, when you politicize them, they're always going to inevitably disappoint you, like Marilene is saying, and they can be useful, like Adam has said, but we should dictate the terms of their usefulness, not give them this oversized role in politics.
So this is a specific question for Marilene, and I think it was from Jimena Gonzalez. And the question was, and this is sort of also in the context, Marilene, of your earlier comments in which you couldn't see any kind of political move. You were saying like the situation is quite dire. But the question here was how opposition parties, how have opposition parties in Brazil addressed Bolsonaro's non-strategy for combating the pandemic, and how are communities and activists organizing responses to this very challenging context in Brazil?
Well, there's a whole movement made by governors and mayors of cities, and small cities and big cities. Once we do not have a central command by the federal government for the pandemic, governors of the states and other authorities are joining to try to compensate for that. And there is a big movement in the communities by the people, by militant people of the left, not exactly the political left, because Brazilian political left is very divided nowadays, and I don't know how they are going to join together again. So this is happening. This is really happening, and this is the hope we have, that this movement from which comes from governors can succeed in the combat of the COVID.
Mm-hmm. And then I have a question for, it's a question for Olufemi, but it could actually, I'd be interested to hear other people's views on this question. Actually, yeah, it would be from Silorum Quest, who's asking, how can activists and scholars advocate for Pan-African goals without falling victim to the fallacy of racial essentialism? In other words, how can we balance advocacy for transnational Black issues with the reality of nuanced, contextual Black identities around the world? So this is the question of like a racial essentialism as a kind of Black Lives Matter politics. Femi?
Yeah, I mean, to vastly oversimplify, I think there's been in history a kind of Pan-Africanism of culture or Pan-Africanism of identity. And then there's been a kind of Pan-Africanism of politics or a Pan-Africanism of interests, right? And I think the latter is, the zone we need to be in. That's not to deny that there's important cultural connections between, people in different parts of the world, or to deny, the power of recognizing cultural affinities from the Caribbean to Western Africa to Brazil to the American South or anything like that. But I think from the point of view of struggle, from the point of view of identifying what we're trying to achieve, the more clearly we put those targets in political terms rather than in terms of affinity or identity, I think the more sensitive we'll be to what's different in different places, and the more successful we'll be, which is maybe more important.
Marilene? Also, Marilene, when you answer, I just wrote a comment here. Mike Harrington, I think he said that he's been told by one of his Brazilian friends of African descent that it'd be easier to organize Black people around being poor rather than being Black. So as part of that question, can you also maybe respond to that?
Yes, I've this is really Brazil. This is really Brazil. Exactly because we are told since very young, since we are born here, that it's as if you were not black, or you were not, what you should aim for your future or for your life is being rich, not being poor. Although being poor means you are black or you're mixed. So there is it's really crazy thing around here. This is changing nowadays, I would say. This I've mentioned in my speech, this coalition for Black Coalition for Rights, which joins 150 other organizations here of Brazilian Black movement. So, and young people are acting very differently. Black young people are acting now very, very different than people of my generation, for example. So there is a change happening. It's in the beginning, I guess, but I guess this is going to be changed in the near future.
Will?
Yeah, I think it's a very difficult question. I think something we all think about very often. I think what Femi was saying about energizing a sort of Pan-Africanism of interests is necessary. And I think, as Marilene is saying, I think it is kind of happening. And I think it's slow work, because I think it requires also trying to sort of rebuild left-wing and progressive forces locally, trying to strengthen our social movements, and in doing so, always being able to draw the connections to social movements everywhere else, which I think now people are better capable of doing than they've ever been, because the access to knowing what's happening elsewhere is so much easier. So I think it's something that is happening, and I think that as it happens, people are able to sort of distinguish themselves from those who have this kind of superficial Pan-Africanism of culture, which is important, but so often doesn't translate into politics, and being able to understand those who seriously believe in a project of collective emancipation beyond national borders.
I mean, in South Africa, there's the example. Maybe you could say a little bit about this. There is the example currently of this Asinamali movement, which means we don't have money, in which you have a combination now of like Black students, and if you want Black poor people, kind of making those connections, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's currently underway in South Africa, where students are protesting against exclusion from universities because of their debts to those universities, and making connections with worker struggles around austerity. But they're not only focusing on austerity in South Africa, but connecting to struggles that have taken place in Nigeria, Burkina Faso, Senegal, other parts of the continent. I think that's something that people are able to do much better than they've ever been before. I think the question that remains is still, when we have these explosions of social unrest, whether it's End SARS or Black Lives Matter, how do we sustain the energy? How do we translate that into sustainable organizing? How do we create institutions that can retain people in the long term? And how do we do that under conditions of constraint, because we're still in the midst of a pandemic? And I think those are the questions that we need to confront going forward.
And Adam, you actually, when you were speaking, you spoke a little bit about this kind of tension around the left and race. Do you want to respond?
Yeah, I mean,
a bigger question.
I think that the triumphs of kind of liberalism, as it kind of triumphed after the Cold War, has kind of started to try to incorporate anti-racism into its politics with great success during the Obama moments at the start, and then slowly kind of began to descend and crash and burn as people realized that you can't do anti-racism by just having somebody who's racialized in the correct way being in the position of power. I mean, we could have just looked across the global south to know that wasn't true, but it's happened in America now, so it's definitely not true. And I think that looking back at history, both in relation to appreciating the radical politics in which Black politics emerges, right? This politics of solidarity, this politics of militancy, this revolutionary politics is fundamentally important. And one of my comrades here in the UK, Annie Olukolu-Teriba, she has a YouTube channel called Black as in Revolution, right? And this is her conception of Blackness. It's Black as in revolution, not Black as in anything else. It's Black as in revolution. And I think utilizing that kind of revolutionary spirit of Black politics, I think, is a really fundamental way to cut through the kind of the ways in which kind of a liberal politics seeks to essentialize it and essentialize Blackness and incorporate it into existing structures of power, rather than seek to dismantle them and revolutionize social relations.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to stay with you. Here's a question from Molly Simpson. This was a question from Adam. She says, I'm also from the UK and have always been disgusted by the lack of colonial and racial history taught in our public education system. How do we best move forward in decolonizing our curriculum?
Okay, yeah, I mean, it's a really important question. Despite the fact that, as I mentioned, Britain is not a nation state, it's an imperial state. Nothing in the British Empire is on any national curriculum. No student learns anything about the empire at all. It's never mentioned. It's as if Britain didn't have an empire. Slavery is mentioned, but it's this thing that happened in the Caribbean. And for some reason, people in the Caribbean speak English, but we're not really sure why. It's all quite mystical. Similarly with why Americans all speak English. Well, again, it's just this mystical thing that's just happened. Everyone just speaks English. Don't worry about why, but bad things happen over there. That's where slavery happens. That's maybe even where a genocide happened. And also the Germans do genocide as well, but not the British. I think that we probably will be waiting a very, very long time indeed if we wait for this, or indeed any British government, to incorporate a critical analysis of the British Empire into national curriculum. In fact, I'm quite scared of this government potentially incorporating the British Empire into the national curriculum, because it will just be like a story of trains and churches and education and civilization and trade and cricket, and it will be worse than nothing. And I think what we instead, of course, need to do is to bolster our community education projects, our grassroots education projects, which Black Britain has a very long and rich history of, and it's now taking new forms, utilising the internet and other kinds of social and technological resources to challenge these types of things. And I know I've been speaking for a long time, but the final thing that I think is crucially important is that the protests that we saw in 2020 in Britain was also an education for Britain, because not only were people protesting in their city centres and outside Parliament and outside police stations, they were tearing down statues of slave traders. They were graffitiing on the big statue of Churchill. Churchill was a racist. It forced Britain to confront not only that history of it being the largest slave trading nation in human history, but also the fact that its most famous head of state was a genocidal white supremacist. And I think through these kinds of movement forms of education as well, we can see Britain kicking and screaming into a more decolonized conception of itself and the world.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask a question to Marilene and Will, but maybe I'll start with Marilene, which is, in both your cases, you've had, well, I should say, including my own, because I'm also South African, we've had governments that were identified with the left or were seen as progressive. In the South African case, they're still in power. In Brazil, they're not. In Brazil, as Marilene pointed out, we're now living in sort of a version of Trumpism, delusional version of Trumpism, quite violent. How did the Lula, the Pete, and you sort of gave a little bit of that, Marilene, how did they tackle race and police violence? I mean, is Bolsonaro's, is it worse under Bolsonaro? Or did the Pete actually do better on the question of police violence and on the question of racism? And in the same way, did the ANC, there are some people who might argue that the ANC does better at the level of rhetoric, but actually at the level of actual, like a lot of the police shootings, etc. They had not happened under Zuma. They didn't happen and Marikana happened which is the murder of 34 miners, were on strike in the north of the country. They happened under Thabo Mbeki. And also a lot of the initial social movements in South Africa, they came out of the Mandela period already. So just kind of, if you can reflect on this question of like, you could have left or progressive governments, but you may not, and again, I'm sort of assuming that this was not the case, but can you answer that question? Can you maybe comment on that, Marilene and Will?
Yes, I would say that PT did not do much. PT is a workers' party here in Brazil. It's the party of Lula and Dilma. They did not do much about security policies. On the contrary, there were lots, some laws were created at that time, imprisoning much more people than before. So this is a critics that is directed to PT, for example, to the party and to Lula. About the policies of security, they did not do much. Yes, and in some aspects, it was even worse. Now, about racism, yes, Lula government really, and Dilma government too, they really created access to universities for Black students that it has never happened here in Brazil. They gave scholarships and lots of, they opened quotas, I don't know how to say this in English. They opened special
quotas.
Yes, for Black students at university. So we never had before their governments, Black people at university, so many Black people at university as we had at that time, and also other policies that were created in favor of Black people. So PT committed some mistakes. But concerning racism, I think there were important achievements. Though young people do not think like me, and they don't agree with what I'm saying here. What they think is this were very few achievements, and this is not what they want. They want Pan-Africanism here. They want a revolution in any way. I don't know. So young people have, they don't vote, for example. They do not agree with this capitalist system and political party system here in Brazil. So Black young people who are joined in groups, in community groups, young organizations, they have their own way of thinking, and that's very, very nice. I think this is important, because nothing happened up to now that changed their situation. So they are very conscious about that. They are trying to fight in other ways, and I hope this is going to be successful.
Will?
To answer your question, it's going to be difficult to try and summarize it, but I think in terms of the ANC governments, I think you're right. And I think South Africa, again, is also a case that sort of vindicates Fanon's warning many years ago about the pitfalls of national consciousness, where the ruling African National Congress during apartheid sort of, it was never left wing, I think is what a lot of people would probably say now. What it did is that it equated the accomplishment of democratic rights as signaling the emancipation of all Black South Africans, including the working class, and said that we have to get democratic rights first, and then the struggle for socialism would come after. That struggle didn't come, because what the African National Congress did is it entrenched a Black bourgeoisie and secured and tried to sort of indigenize South African capitalism. And so its record on police violence has consistently been bad, because as a comprador bourgeoisie, as a new ruling class, it has to suppress working class populations that have since 1994 been contesting the ANC's rule. Initially, that happened through a lot of the formations which was still connected to the ANC, because it was soon after apartheid had ended. So it was still able to function under the umbrella of the ANC. But the turning point was 2008, when I think a lot of people sort of felt that the post-apartheid liberation project had been finally discredited, and they more confidently and independently started to challenge the post-apartheid order. And that's when we've started to notice the ANC's police violence to become more brutal, to become more violent, as it started to realize that it's losing its hegemony in South African life. And most South Africans no longer see the African National Congress as this liberation force. And I think what's required now in South Africa is for a political force to emerge that gives people an alternative that isn't the ANC, that dictates the terms of liberation, not only on pure sort of nationalistic or race grounds, but rather promotes an emancipatory vision that is really about securing goals, securing benefits for the working class. And I think that's where South Africa's political struggle is at the moment, where the National Liberation Project has been shown to be, without being rooted in working class forces, is doomed to fail, and it's doomed to enrich a minority that appropriates the language of radicalism for its own benefit.
So thank you, Will. So we have a question here from Raisa for Olufemi, and she makes reference. I just put a link to the article in the chat, to an article that he wrote, Power Over the Police, that was published in June 2020 in Dissent. And she points out that the solution in that article that Olufemi suggests for policing is giving power back to the people directly, and to divide communities into districts, and decision-making would be held by civilian control boards. So this is kind of about the debate, like, what do you do with the police? And she knows that in New York City, the NYPD is backed by a police union that aggressively supports, any of the actions of the police. How would you, Olufemi, address or have a conversation to police union members about the idea of a civilian control board? I suppose if you're in an elevator, you could have a seminar with them, but imagine you walk into an elevator with them, and they got the police brass, you're in the elevator, you're between floors, and you got to convince them.
I walk back into the
elevator. Anyway, I'm just thinking of time, but you go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think, I think it's a really good question. I think it gets at the heart of what's distinctive about this position about policing from other positions that people have. And I think it comes nicely after what Will was just explaining, because I think there's a view on policing that's especially prevalent in the United States that rightly views policing as tied to racism, but I think ties it to racism in a way that is misleading about what one would need to do to make the institution of policing function in a different way. So people emphasize that policing came from the history of slave patrols in the South, and we could add slave patrols and labor discipline generally in the Caribbean, which the Southern planters inherited. But the Northern history of the development of modern policing in the US is often not talked about as much, which was strike breaking and patrol of immigrant populations. And what unites those is, you could call it racism if you want to distinguish between white ethnics, lower and higher whites. I don't think that's wrong, but I think the more straightforward connection between those two paths of institutional development is exactly what Will was saying. If you have a ruling class, and that ruling class has the means of production and it has the vast majority of society's resources, then the likely role for policing in that context is to keep that basic arrangement of society in place. And you actually can't fix that by giving civilians an advisory role, right? So community policing, which is essentially a PR strategy, is different from the strategy that is being argued for in that piece. Community control over policing, when communities just have the resources and direct command control over what public safety means in their community, and who they would hire to do it and what those people would be doing, whether it would be something more akin to social work, et cetera, et cetera. But until that decision structure leaves the ruling class and goes to the people who have to live with the decisions of these public safety decisions, I just don't see, I don't see a solution to the problem of policing as it currently functions. And so I don't think the form of struggle, I don't think that form of struggle looks like convincing people who have the power that they shouldn't have the power anymore. I think it looks like,
Adam, do you want to
like strikes?
Yeah, sorry. Do you want to add anything about the British example with this?
I mean, I think it's only to say that I think that what we should be doing, what I think a lot of these movements are arguing for, is that we actually erode our reliance on the police and prison system, and that creating kind of community consultancy boards actually further empowers the police. It creates the impression they have more legitimacy. It creates the impression of greater accountability and transparency and all of these types of things, which further legitimizes the work the police do. And in fact, probably what we should be doing, in fact, definitely what we should be doing, is eroding the power and how much the power of the police and how much we rely on the police to improve public safety, and instead thinking about other ways of improving public safety, such as funding centres for survivors of domestic violence, or youth services, or mental health provision, or better educational resources, or secure housing, or decent jobs with strong unions. And all of these kinds of investments will probably actually bring about far better public safety than any kinds of reforms which help to reinforce the power and legitimacy of the police and prison system.
I had one other question, but I think we're running out of time, and I don't want to keep people longer than they hear. But I'm going to throw the question in anyway. It's another one of those elevator questions. We're in between floors. People just got in, and Vanessa Crawford is asking, can we have a global Black Lives Matter movement without dismantling the current moment of late-stage capitalism that is increasing inequality universally, but disproportionately affects the global South women, Black, and Indigenous people? The answer is yes or no. As Olufemi said, are you on the side of the cannibals or are you on the side of socialism? So the answer is
hard no for me.
It's a hard no from Olufemi.
Yeah, I mean, it's a no for me too.
Make it three. Make it three.
3 no's. Marilena, you better be on the side of the nose for this one.
It's a no for me too.
So this project will not go forward. You have to. This sounds like that thing where the people come with a project, they like go, I'm trying to sell you this thing. You know, the thing with the 5 rich people, and you have to give them a project in the room. Anyway, I'm making light of a very serious situation. The answer is you cannot. I think it's very clear. You have to combine the assault on late-stage capitalism with an assault on racism. In any case, this was wonderful. We could keep talking. I want to thank the audience for being nice enough. 82 of you are still around, and I'm very happy for you for being here and for listening to us. To our panelists, Adam, William, Olufemi, and Marilene, thank you very much for coming on here today. I really appreciate it that you've taken time out to be with us here. So with that, we don't vote for barbarism. We're not voting for barbarism. We're not going to say it. We're voting for the other thing. In any case, have a nice day, everybody. Will swung that bat. That's all I'm going to say. Have a nice day, people.
Always have to come out screaming. Thanks, everyone.
See everybody. Take it easy. Thank you.
See you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.